Welcome back to Community Kind, a 100 Women podcast. My name's Alicia Curtis, and today we're diving into what happens when a community decides to fund healthcare at the margins of our society. We are delighted to be joined by Alison Sayer, the CEO of Homeless Healthcare. Alison is a leader that truly understands the intersection between business and social justice. With a career that spans the commercial sector and community leadership, she has been the driving force of homeless healthcare since 2012 and then stepped into the CEO role in 2023. But Alison doesn't just lead a healthcare organisation. She lives and breathes the mission of collective giving. As a committee member of Impact 100 WA, she knows exactly what it feels like to be on both sides of the grant application. As someone seeking funding for vital services, as well as the philanthropist deciding where that money can do the most good. In this episode, we're talking about healthcare at the margins. We'll explore how the 100 Women Grant is helping Alison and her team to provide medical care to those who often feel invisible, and why sustainable, innovative service delivery is the key to long-term change. It's an honest look at the practical difference a grant can make in the lives of women experiencing homelessness. Alison, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, let's explore this issue of what homeless healthcare is actually dealing with. Can you paint me a picture of what it looks like in Perth right at the moment?
Well, the numbers we've got actually come from 2021 because that's the last time the census was conducted. And before I give you the figures, I think it's important to know that the census is done on one night. So just paints a picture of what's going on, and we actually think it's a real underrepresentation of what's going on. At that time in 2021, there were 10,000 people in Western Australia experiencing homelessness. In WA, 28% of those were rough sleeping, and we have the highest rate of rough sleeping across Australia in our very rich state, which is quite appalling. About 1,000 of those we find in and around the Perth area, and then the rest are in the regional area. So quite a lot of rough sleepers in and around Perth and the surrounding suburbs.
And the number of women in that situation is actually rising. What's actually driving that?
I think there's two drivers to that. The main driver is the cost of living and the housing situation that's currently going on in the state. There's just not enough housing for people, and more people are getting pushed out of housing because they simply can't afford it. The rental prices have gone up dramatically. The cost of everyday living has gone up dramatically. So a lot of people who were just on the fringes are now getting pushed out and living on the streets, which is a real shame. The other big driver, I think, is the increase in family and domestic violence that we're seeing. And it's interesting as to whether it's just become more of an issue that people talk about and aware of, and then women are like, well, I don't have to put up with this, so I'm going to leave, or whether or not the rates are just increasing, like whether more is being reported or whether actually there is a dramatic increase due to all the stresses that are going on in people's lives at the moment.
Now, it's one thing being a person experiencing homelessness. Now, think about you're a woman and you're pregnant as well. Can you tell us what that situation looks like?
Well, I think you've got to consider what would drive someone who's pregnant to remain homeless. And often what we find is women who are homeless, who are pregnant, have had a long history of trauma, and also probably a long history of family and domestic violence. There's often substance use that is wrapped up in that, and substance use can either be something that then causes people to become homeless, or it can be a coping mechanism once they are homeless. So it can often be quite sort of chicken or egg situation with substance use issues. What we find with women who are pregnant and homeless is they often try to hide it from anyone official, and that's because historically and still today, a lot of babies are removed from women who are living in precarious situations. Sometimes that's appropriate, but other times it's simply because of their circumstances and the fact that they're homeless.
And so unless you have stable housing as a pregnant woman, your child's removed from you at birth for a number of years?
Yeah, it depends on the situation. But one of the primary reasons babies are removed is because there's no stable housing. And that's one of the main reasons why the Department of Family Services will remove children. The department are trying to do the right
As much
thing.
as they can.
But when you simply don't have appropriate housing to put women in and they're left living on the street, it probably isn't appropriate that they have their children with them. So you can understand there's a real tension that goes on. And to their credit, if they've got substance use issues, they'll often work with women to try and support them to maintain, custody of their children. But it is unfortunately just a very harsh reality that a lot of babies are removed.
And I can imagine it's a very hard situation to break out of as a woman too.
Yeah, because you're dealing with cycles and generational trauma, intergenerational trauma that goes on through no fault of their own. They've been born into a family where there might have been a lot of abuse or substance misuse, and it's really hard to get out of that. You're traumatised and therefore you respond in certain ways, and how do you break that cycle of not responding to your own trauma?
Yeah, absolutely. So support's needed, and homeless healthcare has a program called the Together program.
Yes.
And it's about providing a street outreach nurse dedicated to pregnant women who are experiencing homelessness. So tell me more about that program.
So there's actually two parts to the Together program. The Together program initially started as a housing solution for pregnant women experiencing homelessness. It is only 4 units, but it's 4 units where we can put women, and it's in collaboration with Uniting WA. The whole premise of the service is to house women who are pregnant, hopefully during their pregnancy, and then provide that wraparound support, so psychosocial support and also healthcare support, making sure they're going to their prenatal appointments, making sure they go to their antenatal appointments, supporting women. And you have to realise that a lot of these women have had very negative experiences with the healthcare system, particularly when you're homeless. Health becomes such a low priority. You're just trying to survive on the streets, right? So you're looking for food, you're looking for some form of shelter. For women in particular, they're looking for safety. A lot of them get assaulted on the street. And so often they end up in the hospital because they've been assaulted, or they've left their health so long that what was a chronic condition ends up becoming acute, and then they collapse or take themselves to emergency. Often when they're in the hospital system, and again, no fault of hospital workers, it's pretty tough in the hospital system at the minute. They're overrun. Yeah. Often they don't get treated particularly well, and they get cycled back out pretty quickly. So a hospital visit can be quite traumatic, and then the trust in the health system is eroded. And so that's what we find, is that they're not seeking out any healthcare. So us taking healthcare to them in the Together program is about re-establishing trust with the health system and getting them to engage, because often they will not engage, and they won't go to their antenatal appointments, and they won't go to their postnatal appointments as well. So that's the housing side of the Together program. And then what we then wanted to do, so we were inundated with referrals for the program, and the demand well exceeded the 4 units that we had, and that we were recognising there were still lots of women on the street who were pregnant but not getting any support. So the other side of the Together program is the outreach side, where we have a nurse who goes out on the street and engages with women on the street. And again, a lot of it is about building trust. A lot of it is about getting them to engage in mainstream health system and supporting them to do that. So navigating it with them.
Yeah, so you can understand, women in that situation, they've potentially had traumatic experiences with healthcare. There's a fear of maybe their child being taken away from them, so that leads to them not wanting to access those services. And so with the Together program, you've got both sides. You're looking at the housing issue, which is, hopefully going some way to fixing that first problem of them not having sustainable housing, but then also the healthcare aspect with the outreach nurse. You said you were inundated with referrals. The program had, I've got the numbers, 155 referrals in under 2 years, 155 referrals. So tell me what sits behind a referral. What does that mean? And, who's sending women to you and how does that work?
Huge number of referrals come from the Department of Family Services, ironically. So they recognise that there's a big issue and they're doing what they can to support. Other people we get referrals from will be the main maternity hospital in Perth, often does referrals, and they have a fantastic team in there, Wandus, who are particularly good with women who have substance use issues, and then also from other social services, so, Uniting and Vinnie's or other homeless services.
So the 100 Women grant increased the hours of your outreach nurse. So what does more hours do? What's the outcomes of that funding that supports the nurses?
What it gave us was the ability to have someone dedicated to doing outreach for women. And as I mentioned about the trust and the engagement, that just requires so much time and effort and persistence. So
building that trust,
absolutely,
relationship, and it is that ongoing process, right?
Yeah, and it's about going out every week, persist, engage. Sometimes they don't engage, but just keep trying. And it also then allowed us to support the women to go to some of these appointments and engage in the health system and also provide basic health care to them on the spot as well. You've got a registered nurse out there. They can do all sorts of things as a primary healthcare nurse, and we can cover, address some of the substance use, mental health, any of their chronic health conditions we can address.
In homeless healthcare, you talk about this importance of the first 1,000 days from conception right through to a child's second birthday. And for a mother who's, sleeping in a car or has unstable housing, those first 1,000 days can be quite traumatic, but that has a flow-on effect to the child as well. So can you explain how the Together program actually really changes the trajectory of both the mother and the child in that sort of critical first 1,000 days?
Yeah, sure. There's been a lot of research around the first 1,000 days and that, if mum is not well or doesn't have good nutrition or is abusing substances, the impact that then has on the child. And then if the child is born in a chaotic, abusive or, unstable environment, the ongoing impacts that will then have the child for the rest of their life. And that's what we talk about, that intergenerational trauma. So the trauma from mum just gets passed on. And I think they're actually proving that genetically the trauma gets passed on in genes. It's not actually just an environmental thing. Those 1,000 days are really pivotal to people's future outcomes, right? Yeah. And how your life is going to be. So the concept of the 100 Women program is let's stabilise mum as best we can, and in doing that you're supporting the fetus, and then in the early stages of a child's birth, again by stabilising mum, she can provide better support and the outcomes are so much better,
Yeah.
So it's fundamentally that.
And lifelong effects, really, because of that point of support.
Yes. And so if mum has better nutrition or maybe can reduce her drug and alcohol, it has knock-on effects to the health outcomes of the baby.
Yeah. You shared a story at one of our recent 100 Women events about a woman called Annie. And can you just share here on the podcast what happened with her?
Yeah, so Annie was a woman that we engaged with. She already had 4 children who were all in care of the state, unfortunately, but she became pregnant again with her 5th. And around the same time, her eldest became 18. And she started to see that her 18-year-old was going down the same path of what her life had been, which had been substance misuse, domestic violence. She could just see all the same patterns happening again. And it was enough of a trigger for her to go, I'm not letting this happen again. At the time, she was battling with addiction. She was homeless, but we engaged with her. We managed to get her some healthcare support and then also support for bub at the same time. And then with a lot of convincing, we managed to get her into a stabilisation program, which is specifically for substance use for mum and baby. So those number of places in those services is very limited, but we did manage to get Annie in, and she was doing remarkably well and managed to keep custody of this baby number 5. She's had a couple of wobbles, but she's still doing okay.
Yeah, how courageous of her, to have that. Obviously someone dealing with, immense challenges that probably many of us can't even imagine, to have 4 children already taken into care, but to show that change can happen with the right supports.
And I think that's the crucial thing, right? Like, there is hope for people, and if they are supported in the right way, don't underestimate what they can achieve.
Absolutely.
Because they can achieve amazing things.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, gosh, we all have wobbles at the best of times.
I don't. What are you talking about?
Parenting journeys.
Yeah, absolutely. Parenting is hard enough for people who are highly educated and have all the right support.
Absolutely.
Let alone for people who have none of that. It must be incredibly challenging.
Yeah, yeah. As you say, it does show what's possible, and that cycle can be broken with the right supports. Being able to support her to get into that mother and baby rehab program is crucial, right?
Yeah, crucial step, because without that I don't think the outcomes would be anywhere near as good. It's hard because a lot of the women we've supported we've not had success with, as in they have still had their children removed. But what you have been able to do maybe is, with that little bit of support, improve what could be their outcome ultimately.
Yeah.
So that's what we kind of hold on to, is
Absolutely.
that we have done some work and the women have done some work as well. And so hopefully there'll be some ongoing effects from that.
Yeah, absolutely. 100 Women members are really passionate about seeing their collective dollars solve these complex problems. And sometimes that's not easy. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back a lot of the time. And as you say, holding on to, the knowledge and the understanding of these issues and how it might best serve the next person who comes into your organisation. When it comes to supporting pregnant women, how does a grant like 100 Women help homeless healthcare be a little bit more innovative and flexible in comparison to maybe more traditional grant offerings?
It's a really good question, and I think this kind of giving enables us to innovate and enables us to do things that traditional funding would not really support, or they wouldn't support unless we'd piloted it for a couple of years and showed outcomes. So I think that's the wonderful thing about philanthropy, is it gives organisations that ability to try new things and then demonstrate the benefit of that, and then go to government or other funding bodies and get ongoing funding. For us, it was so wonderful to get the 100 Women support, because we could see there was such a demand and yet we couldn't do much about it. We were sort of over-resourced. We were well and truly doing more than we were being funded for. So it then allowed us to have that dedicated outreach nurse who could then provide support for so many more women, and we just wouldn't have been able to do that. We just didn't have the resources to do that. So it was a really great funding opportunity for us to get.
It's so fabulous to hear how we can support organisations to get that next step of funding, or show the demand that's there and what can be achieved. Because the return on investment, I think, is just incredible when you talk about what you're actually able to provide for the small amounts of funding that we're able to give you. But it does enable, longer term funding. How are you going with getting some of that ongoing longer term funding?
We managed to stretch the 100 Women funding out over 2 years. So we haven't quite finished yet. So we've still got a little bit more time. And we have gone back to the original funders of the other side of the service, and they seem very keen to continue and expand the scope. So we are hopeful that it will continue, which is fantastic because that just means so many more women are supported. But again, we can't innovate without little bursts of funding like that. So, it's been great.
Yeah. Where is the gaps really in that housing support? Do you see, or are there other gaps that still exist?
The biggest gap is the supported housing, housing in general.
Yes.
But supported housing dedicated to women who are very vulnerable, who have had experience of domestic violence. You can't just plonk them anywhere. And they also need heaps of support. And it has to be housing that's actually dedicated to women, because the risk that you place them in if men can access the service as well, it's really tricky. So, and I think the biggest thing that we've learned from the Together program is just how much support they need. We're in the sector and we understand, but the complexity that we're dealing with and the amount of support the women need just on a day-to-day basis of caring for baby or caring for themselves, it's actually quite a lot. Talking before about it's hard enough for most of us.
Yes.
So it probably is very much understandable, but it has been a big learning for us. And particularly if the Department of Family Services get involved and they're on a protection order, so they're retaining custody of their child, but they very often need 24 hours eyes on baby by someone. So mum's got to be with somebody 24 hours of the day. So you actually need a 24-hour service, which is expensive and difficult to run. The good news is I know of multiple services that are in the wings and in development, one of which that we'll be heavily involved in. So there will be more options in a year or two's time.
Oh, how exciting.
In the meantime, we have to just hold.
Well, as you say, I think the innovation that comes from organisations at the coalface is just incredible. We have members right across Australia. Do you see the same issues happening in other states? Are there things that people can do within your organisation or elsewhere in Australia that supports women who are pregnant, who are experiencing homelessness?
Yeah, look, I think the problem is Australia-wide, and I certainly know of other organisations in different states doing similar services. WA is unique in that our proportion of rough sleepers is so high, so we are probably seeing proportionately a lot more women on the street than the other states are.
Not something to be proud of.
No, not at all, unfortunately. Yeah, but there's several different orgs across Australia doing slightly different things. None of them, I don't think, are doing dedicated street outreach. I think we are relatively unique in that space of having healthcare on the streets, supporting pregnant women. I know lots of people want to help and love the idea of volunteering or offering support in that way, but the work is complex. It requires specialists. Our nurses that provide this kind of support have lots of experience of dealing with people who are experiencing homelessness and their complex needs, which are...
You have to be highly trained.
You do have to be highly trained, and it's also quite risky. So you have to be able to assess risk and know when it's safe to engage with people or not engage with people.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So we don't encourage volunteers, but there's lots of other ways that you can help support us. The fundamental way is funding. It's so unglamorous, but, at the end of the day, that's what helps us provide all the services. So that's really important. There's also other ways, particularly with our street outreach work, because it's only one part of what we do, but particularly for the street outreach work, in winter we'll give out beanies to help people maintain core body temperature. socks because, as you can imagine, living on the street, it's in the winter, it's wet. Very often people get horrible fungus and terrible infections in their feet. So keeping their feet dry and warm is really important for good health. And we also give out things like toiletries, just things with basic hygiene, which helps stabilise people's health. And you'll see there's a big thread in what I'm saying here is that we don't give out food, we don't give out other things. What we're trying to do is dedicate our support in the health space. So if we just try and support people's health. In summer, it's a bit different. We'll give out thongs because people get burnt feet on pavement. So having a pair of thongs is really important, and then that stops an infection from a burn on the base of their feet. And then also things like sunburn cream or insect repellent, because then you're preventing burn and, all sorts of nasty infections from horrible bites. So
Yeah. What's the biggest benefit that you see long term of this work that you're able to do?
The biggest benefit, I think, is that we give people hope and we give people connection, because a lot of people don't have that on the street, and they have someone who is taking the time to care for them and help them on a forward path. And a lot of the people don't have that. So for me, that's what I love, and I think that's what our staff hold on to as well, because it can be really tough work, and you can see people take 2 steps forwards and then 3 steps back. And that can be really challenging on a day-to-day basis. But I think what keeps our staff going is that connection with people and their stories, because they all have such amazing stories and they're all human.
We're all people.
And I think people forget that.
Yeah. I think that's such an important reminder, that hope and connection and how important that is to people. I know, just in my research of people experiencing homelessness, people don't even look at you, they walk by, and just to look at someone, to smile, to take a moment of your day, means a lot. And, that's what, each and every one of us can do, but the work that you're doing, your team are doing, of really connecting deeply with these people and realising that they are a person. There is a need for us to connect with everyone, no matter what their background is or what they're experiencing. And not only that, dealing with some of the most vulnerable people experiencing homelessness, being pregnant.
Yeah. And by supporting the most vulnerable in our society, it does nobody any good by having such a disparity in society. It costs the system more. It means all our outcomes are worse. So if we can help bring up the most vulnerable and support them, everyone's better off.
Yeah, absolutely. You've given us some incredible insights today. Thank you so much for sharing the work that you do. You provide such an innovative service in our community to those most vulnerable people, and we just are so proud to be able to support you in the way of a grant and also by amplifying the stories that you've shared with us today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, and also thank you so much for 100 Women for the support. We really appreciate it.
So what you've heard today is definitely not an easy story to hear, and it really wasn't meant to be. It's the work that Alison and her team, what they're doing is really hard work, and it's the system that they're working against, but it's really critical work, and your donation is part of that story in achieving that systemic change that we can achieve. 100 Women is a giving circle. Every member who contributes as little as $300 a year, which is really just a coffee a week, together with over 400 members across Australia, that number becomes $200,000 that we are able to fund organisations like Homeless Healthcare, organisations doing the work that the market sometimes won't fund or hasn't been able to reach as yet. Every member votes on where the funding goes. Every dollar you give goes straight to community organisations and projects like the ones that you hear on our podcast today. Annie, Sarah, and the women whose names we don't say on air, These are the measure of what collective giving actually does. So if you'd like to be part of that, we would love you to join our circle. Find out more about 100 Women at 100women.com.au. The link is in the show notes. Thank you for listening to Community Kind today. We'll see you next month.